During my mother's funeral, a tense atmosphere took shape when my mother-in-law arrived. With a smile, she casually mentioned that my home would now belong to her son. As she wandered through the rooms, she contemplated which one she might claim, even hinting at one with, "I wonder if this room would be suitable for me." I calmly corrected her, explaining that I was inheriting the house. Unfazed, she argued that since I was married to her son, everything I owned essentially belonged to him. "So, in a way, this house is my son's, right?" she said with a grin, her insensitivity glaring as she cheerfully suggested we start getting along better and implying a move-in was imminent. My frustration mounted as she seemed oblivious to my grief. "Why bring this up now? Can't you see this isn't the time?" I thought to myself. The house, filled with cherished memories of my parents, felt threatened by her unreasonable claim. Reflecting on my journey, I'm a 44-year-old who had nearly given up on marriage after turning 41. But then I met Brian, my now husband, who is 5 years younger. We connected through a mutual acquaintance, and he always respects my views, including our honeymoon plans. Although he initially suggested Europe, he happily agreed to my preference for the Maldives. However, complications arose when Brian mentioned his mother's desire to live with us due to his father's declining health. Despite understanding her difficulties, we had agreed before marriage that we wouldn't live together. I reminded him of this, and he promised to discuss it with his mother. Throughout these interactions, it became clear that I needed to stand firm to protect my family home from becoming just another asset claimed by my mother-in-law. Brian, recognizing my concerns, agreed to support me in ensuring our home remained a sanctuary, untouched by unwanted intrusions. Meeting a wonderful person always brings joy, yet a pang of regret haunts me. My father passed away 4 years before I got married, never seeing my wedding or my reassurances about the future. He was a disciplined executive at a small to medium-sized enterprise, and I admire him deeply for his dedication and ability to provide for our family comfortably, despite the modest scale of the business. This respect deepened as I began my career and faced the challenges of the workplace. 3 years into my marriage, my mother also passed away. During these difficult times, Brian was incredibly supportive, constantly checking in on me and suggesting I rest. At the funeral, which we held at our family home to maintain a personal touch, I was comforted by his presence and care. However, the mood shifted when Sandra, my mother-in-law, arrived. Although she expressed her condolences, her presence brought a stark reminder of the challenges I faced in protecting my family's legacy. I acknowledged Sandra's thanks with a polite nod. Our relationship had been cordial but distant since we hadn't lived together and only interacted occasionally. However, her demeanor during the funeral struck me as unusually cheerful, which felt out of place. She began by thanking me for managing the funeral so smoothly, attributing it to my efforts. Then, quite abruptly, she said, "The funeral is over now, isn't it? Let's drop the formalities." I was taken aback, having initially believed her kindness was sincere. Sandra proceeded to comment on how splendid the house was, despite my protests about some areas being a bit untidy. She dismissed my concerns with a casual wave and boldly ventured further into the house, declaring, "My son will inherit this house. I wonder if I should take this room." I hesitated, trying to process her words and intentions. It became clear that her earlier compassion had been a mere facade, and her true aim was to claim my family home. During a tense conversation, I reminded Sandra that I was the rightful inheritor of the property. With a smirk, she responded, "I know your parents had no other children, and a wife's belongings belong to her husband, right? So this house essentially belongs to my son, doesn't it?" Her comment left me exasperated. With unsettling cheerfulness, she suggested we should start getting along better and announced her plan to convert one of the rooms into hers. Alarmed, I asked if this meant we would be living together. Without hesitation, she confirmed, "Exactly. With such a beautiful house, it would be a shame to leave rooms empty when two people can comfortably live here. Plus, I won't have to take care of my husband all by myself." This conversation occurred shortly after my mother had passed away, and Sandra's insensitivity only fueled my growing frustration. Why would she bring this up during such a sensitive time? Just then, my husband overheard our exchange and intervened. "Mom, what are you saying? This isn't the right time for such discussions," he scolded. Unfazed, Sandra retorted, "Why make such a fuss?" My husband firmly insisted that she leave and escorted her out, apologizing to me afterward. "Sorry, my mom can be unreasonable," he said. I appreciated his support and replied, "It's fine, thanks for handling it." However, as we began to move past the funeral and discuss the future of my family home, I noticed a subtle shift in my husband's approach. 12 days after the funeral, we talked about the possibility of moving out of our cramped apartment. "This apartment is getting too small," I suggested. "Shouldn't we consider moving back to my parents' house?" He agreed, saying, "Yeah, you're right. With the possibility of having kids and needing more space, it would be better than squeezing into this tiny place." But then he hesitated and added, "Well, we should start preparing for the move." As we discussed the details, he revealed an unexpected idea. Considering the spacious house and the empty rooms, he suggested, maybe my parents could move in with us. I was taken aback and asked, "Are you suggesting we live together?" Recently, I had noticed a change in my husband. Despite previously valuing my opinions, I began to question if he was merely agreeing with me without fully considering the implications or if he was being unduly influenced by his mother's wishes. His readiness to accommodate her ideas was becoming increasingly apparent, challenging my perception of him as a supportive partner. The suggestion to live together made me doubt his genuine stance on the matter. Despite my clear objections to cohabitation, he seemed to waver, often siding with his mother. "Haven't I made it clear that we won't live together?" I reminded him frequently. His usual response was, "But Mom keeps insisting." I reminded him of how he had stood up to his mother at the funeral, confronting her about her inappropriate behavior. "You were opposed to living together then, weren't you?" I challenged. He conceded, "Yes, I was upset about her barging in. But that doesn't mean I'm entirely against the idea of living together. I just didn't think such a crucial decision should be made hastily at the funeral." Though he had seemed to agree with my stance initially, it was becoming clear that his inclinations might align more with his mother. Moreover, he appeared to avoid making definitive decisions, possibly believing that staying neutral would absolve him of having to choose sides. This was frustrating. I was firmly against the idea of living with someone who intruded into my parents' house during the funeral and presumed to claim a room. "Please make sure your mother understands this," I insisted. Reluctantly, he replied, "Why are you so bothered by it?" "Fine, I'll let her know." My perspective on living with my in-laws had shifted dramatically after witnessing my mother-in-law's behavior at my mother's funeral. The idea of sharing the home my father had built, a place filled with cherished memories, with her was now unthinkable. This frustration was compounded by my husband's lack of firmness in communicating my stance on cohabitation. When my mother-in-law directly challenged me, she asked, "Why are you opposing living together in such a spacious house? You're Brian's wife now, and his father and I are practically your parents too. Why such strong opposition?" I reiterated my refusal to cohabitate, explaining the challenges I faced managing alone and mentioning my husband's mobility issues. She accused me of abandoning them, to which I reminded her of the practical reasons we had discussed before. Despite my sympathy for my father-in-law's health, the thought of being overwhelmed by additional responsibilities if we lived together loomed large. I made it clear that if cohabitation were ever to be considered, a significant improvement in both my husband's and mother-in-law's attitudes toward my needs and boundaries would be non-negotiable. A few days after my mother-in-law had called me heartless, I was surprised to see my husband rearranging our living room. Curious, I asked, "What are you doing?" "Is this for storing moving boxes?" He replied, "No, I'm planning to make space for 2 beds." The mention of 2 beds immediately filled me with dread. Cautiously, I inquired, "Are your parents coming to stay?" To my dismay, he said, "No, they're moving in today." The news hit me hard. Despite my clear objections, it seemed my husband and mother-in-law had decided on cohabitation without my consent. "Why is this happening?" I questioned, my frustration growing. He explained, "Their lease is up, so we decided they'd move here instead of renewing it. It'll be cramped with 4 of us, but we're moving soon, right? Just bear with it for a little while." "Distress," I reiterated. "That's not what I meant. Why is cohabitation even on the table? I've said before I don't want to live with someone who barged into my parents' house on the day of the funeral and suggested living in this room." He promised to talk to his mom and added, "We'll be living together from now on, so please try to get along." Annoyed, I asked, "Why do you prioritize everything your mom says?" He tried to clarify, "It's not about prioritizing her. I listen to both your opinions and make judgments." However, it was clear that when it came to his mother, he seemed unable to resist her influence, believing he was making independent decisions. I had always seen him as kind, but alongside my mother-in-law, he seemed to become a different person, inadvertently pushing me into an unwanted living situation. As we welcomed my in-laws into our already cramped apartment, my mother-in-law began to complain about the living conditions. I apologized for the sudden addition of 2 more people and assured them we would manage until we could move to a larger space. While my father-in-law, Frank, seemed polite at first, it quickly became apparent that he was inclined to follow my mother-in-law's lead, becoming just another yes man. A few days later, my mother-in-law asked me to run an errand to buy a medicated patch for her, a small request that nonetheless added to my growing list of frustrations. As the situation deteriorated, it became increasingly clear that living together under one roof was becoming untenable. My mother-in-law was openly excited about the move, eagerly anticipating the space and comfort it would provide. Unbeknownst to her, I had been quietly making preparations of my own, determined to protect my parents' legacy and preserve the sanctity of my childhood home. I made a drastic decision after about 12 quiet days. I officially renounced my inheritance, securing court approval to relinquish my rights to the property. When I announced this decision to my family, it was clear that the resolution had come at a significant personal cost. I explained that this house held immense sentimental value for me, and I couldn't bear the thought of my mother-in-law living there. Therefore, I decided to let it go, keeping it as a beautiful memory in my heart. My mother-in-law was incredulous, berating me. "What madness possessed you? Even if you didn't want it, you could have sold it for a good sum. Why just abandon it?" I remained calm and replied, "Selling it would only mean you'd end up relying on that money. I thought it would be clearer if I simply had nothing to do with it." She was furious. "We moved out of our previous place for this. What are you doing? How will you make it up to us?" I stood firm, my voice steady. "I've consistently opposed cohabitation. You forced this situation upon us without proper discussion, so I took a stand." The revelation of my renunciation left my husband and mother-in-law visibly shaken. Their faces drained of color, and they were speechless. My father-in-law looked on, bewildered by the unfolding drama. Pushing the conversation further, I turned to my husband, Brian. "I've been thinking about getting a divorce. What do you think?" He stammered, taken aback. "A divorce?" Before he could fully articulate his thoughts, my mother-in-law interjected aggressively. "Brian, you should divorce this ridiculous wife immediately." Her demand for a divorce was harsh but expected. It served as a critical test to see if my husband could make an independent decision in such a crucial moment. Brian mumbled a response, still struggling to articulate his position. Seeing his hesitation, my resolve hardened. "Fine, divorce seems to be the only option," I declared. My father-in-law tried to intervene. "Brian, it can't be helped. Your mom is insisting." Brian finally spoke up, albeit reluctantly. "Well, you seem to want a divorce too, and maybe that's for the best." Even in this pivotal moment, it was clear that my husband, along with his father, remained unable to stand up to my mother-in-law's dominant will, always defaulting to her wishes. When my husband suggested divorce, it felt like he was trying to portray it as a concession for my benefit, resigned yet determined. I decided to proceed with the divorce and planned to move out with only a few essentials. That night, I stayed in a budget hotel, knowing I had urgent tasks ahead. The following day, I took a half day from work to return to the courthouse and handle the necessary paperwork. A few days later, my mother-in-law called, clearly agitated. "What's going on? It seems the house is now becoming yours. Why this sudden change?" she demanded, having likely learned of the situation through the estate division process. "Yes, the house is mine," I confirmed. Her accusations came swiftly. "You forged documents and deceived us." I responded calmly, "Why would I forge court documents? Those documents are genuine." She pressed further, "If you were supposed to renounce the inheritance, why is the house becoming yours?" I explained. Right after I submitted the renunciation application, I withdrew it. Renouncing an inheritance is difficult once accepted, but it takes about a month to process, during which it can be retracted. The documents I showed you were from the application stage. I led you to believe I had relinquished the house and used the threat of divorce to gauge reactions and decide my next steps. I had hoped my husband might show some reluctance about the divorce, which would have led me to reconsider and clarify the situation about the house. However, things progressed differently. Since the house was acquired before the divorce, it was subject to division, but because it was an inherited asset, it was exempt from property division. My mother-in-law tried to salvage what she could. If the house was jointly acquired, it would be considered marital property. You two were supposed to sell it and split the money, right? I clarified, specific assets like inherited property aren't eligible for division. As for any money Brian might receive through property division, our short marriage complicates that. The shorter the marriage, the less likely individual inherited assets are divided. She persisted, what about the money Brian would get through property division? I calmly responded, since we've only been married for a few years, the brief duration further complicates dividing inherited assets. After being branded selfish and heartless, I stood firm in my resolve to protect my family home. I'm safeguarding this house because it holds precious memories of my parents. I don't want people like you living there. If you have further complaints, please consult a lawyer. Following that heated exchange, the divorce proceedings moved faster than expected. It seemed my mother-in-law had urged my husband to expedite the process. Regardless of her motivations, the divorce was finalized, freeing me from the ongoing stress of dealing with my in-laws. There was a profound sense of relief, as if I had successfully protected my father's home from disruption. After moving out, my ex-in-laws faced a more cramped space with one less person. My former mother-in-law began searching for new living arrangements, but her age made passing rental screenings challenging. Eventually, my ex-husband found a smaller single-family home for them. Although it was a downgrade in size and likely came with higher rent, it provided them with their own space. He took on the responsibility of supporting his parents, facing a challenging road ahead. Initially thrilled by the prospect of moving into the large house left by my father, my former mother-in-law had to settle for a considerably smaller and different reality, a disappointing turn of events for her. As for me, I began a new chapter in the house my parents left behind. It feels warm, almost as if they are still with me, preserving their legacy and the memories we shared. This new beginning marks a time of healing and reflection, honoring my parents' memory in the peace of their beloved home.